Hi everybody, thank you for joining in on the webinar. Streamline your timeline and review workflows with Nuke Studio Hiero and Hiero Player. And we'll follow this up with a Q&A. So my name is Terry Rysat. I'm the Head of Creative Services for the Americas at Foundry. For this webinar, we're going to be looking at the different softwares. We will talk about some of the differences between them. We will cover some examples of who would be using either Nuke Studio, Hiero, and Hiero Player, depending on their position in the studio. We're going to look at some key day-to-day tools that you should be using on your projects for project organization, departmental communication, and the review workflow. We're also going to look at how to procedurally set up your timeline for ingesting media from other departments. We're going to look at tools to prepare timelines for review sessions. And we're also going to look at an asset manager example that we can be publishing and ingesting data from to build out these dynamic timelines. And then lastly, we're going to look at how artists can use Hiero Player to review their shots in context before they're going to be submitting them for review to their supervisors. First off, let's look at a couple of key differences between Hiero and Nuke Studio. The first difference is that in Nuke Studio, we have a nodal compositing toolset right inside of the application. This means we not only have the timeline application portion, but we also have NUKEX running inside the program with access to all of the NUKEX toolset. The second key difference is that we have additional soft effects, which are timeline effects, exclusive to Nuke Studio. These are Create Comp and Create Comp Special. This allows us to select footage and create a Nuke script directly in the timeline, which automatically creates a track and a comp container. Now, this is an important feature that we'll need to take an in-depth look into at a later time. Now let's have a look at Hiero Player. Hiero Player is a desktop review tool that lets you play back timelines from Hiero and Nuke Studio. You can think of this as an artist-friendly version of a timeline application where the artist can see the sequence that they're working on in context and quickly compare multiple versions of their work before submitting it for review. There's some key differences for Hiero Player versus Nuke Studio and Hiero. For example, you aren't meant to online or conform inside of Hiero Player, so that means you won't be able to import an EDL, XML, or AAF, or use the export structure that Nuke Studio and Hiero have. You also won't have the spreadsheet view that the other two applications have. You can open Nuke Studio and Hiero projects. The interface highlight color will be blue, and that indicates that the project is read-only. You can't delete clips or bins or shots and make edits to the timeline when the highlight is blue. You can, however, drag source clips onto new tracks in the timeline. If you modify the project this way, you can save the work by saving it as a player project. For a full detailed comparison between the applications, you can just head over to our website and then go to the Hiero page, Features, and you'll see a detailed list of all the differences between Hiero Player, Hiero, and Nuke Studio. Now, who would be using these different applications? So first, let's talk about Nuke Studio. In many cases, you see supervisor and department leads using it. VFX supervisors, comp supervisors, 3D supervisors, they can all benefit from Nuke Studio. It's also very helpful if the leads have access to it. The 3D supervisor can be using it to view sequences, to view and compare different versions of the 3D work that's being done. They can mark up the timeline to see the progression or statuses of sequence and shots. They can annotate on the shots and the artist can address these notes. Another nice aspect is that they can be communicating through the timeline with other departments. Slap comps for the lighting department can be procedurally generated for 3D artists to check their work. And many studio lighting artists have access to Nuke where they can go in and tweak the lighting based on these slap comps. On the 2D side of things, a VFX supervisor can be using Nuke Studio to see notes from other departments. They can be leaving notes for the comp supervisor, leads, any general or project notes. They can quickly do any keying in the timeline for producers and directors to better understand the context of sequences. They can also see any new media being brought into the project, maybe new plates, new shots, maybe they're adding it. Compositing supervisors would have Nuke Studio where they can also view notes and statuses from other departments, marking up shots with specific direction for the artists. They can create comps with all the necessary media for the artists. They can view different comp versions and explore the artist's comps directly from the timeline for QA and troubleshooting. Another important thing that all departments using Nuke Studio can do is use the export functionality that's built in to have Nuke Studio distribute media into the pipeline at any stage of production. The people using Nuke Studio usually need access to the node graph, even if it's minimal. Also, depending on the studio structure, sometimes one of the positions mentioned are running the review session. Now, this way, any compositing tweaks that can be made during the review session can be done on the fly and automatically updated into the timeline. Now, those are some examples, and we can see that Nuke Studio covers a broad area of the pipeline. Now, let's talk about Hiero. Hiero is great for VFX editors and project coordinators to bring in media from the editorial department. They can distribute the plates, renders, update the timeline with the new shots and renders. Just like Nuke Studio, they can make sure the timeline is up to date with the newest versions of the edit, the shots, and also distribute media into the pipeline. They can leave annotations and notes and also create Nuke scripts if necessary from an export function. Whomever is running the review session, maybe it's a VFX editor using Hiero, if they run the review session and don't have compositing experience, rather the review session is all about viewing and annotating the shots, in this case Hiero would make sense. Now in some cases producers and directors also like having access to Hiero as they can view the edit and shots and versions that the artists are working on, and they can make notes and annotations to shots in the timeline. So generally with Hiero, we see people that are not going to need access to compositing, so having access to NUKEX wouldn't be necessary. In this case, it makes sense for them to run Hiero. Hiero Player is suited for artists. We spoke about this earlier, and it becomes a daily tool for artists where they can review their work in context. So whether it's an animator who wants to view all their shots in sequence, a lighter that wants to make sure the continuity is there between their shots, compositors that need to view the edit and how their shots are maintaining continuity within the edit, a key feature that Hiero Player shares with all the other applications is the ability to quickly switch versions of the shots and review your work before submitting it for approval. So all three applications have their place in the pipeline, and hopefully that gives a better understanding of where they sit. Okay, so now let's get going with our sequence. We're going to jump into Nuke Studio. Okay, so let's get started in Nuke Studio. Now, just a quick note, I'll be using Nuke Studio, and everything we look at will also be applicable to Hiero. If we use any Nuke Studio exclusive features, I'll be sure to mention it. Now let's get a lay of the land. On the left here is our project window where we have our project, our sequences housed, as well as our bins. On the right here is where we have all the thumbnails for the bins. Down below we have our sequence properties, we have our sequence timeline below, we have our properties for the clips, and then we have our viewer. The UI is very customizable. We can set out any custom layout that we want. We have some pre-built layouts that come with the programs. You can also use the Shift, F1, F2, F3, F4, F5, F6 keys to toggle through different pre-built layouts. Shift F1 is our conforming layout, and this is quite a nice handy one because you can get to your spreadsheet quite quickly. Now you can of course make your spreadsheet in any view and save that as a custom workspace, but having access to it just by quickly toggling over to it is nice. The spreadsheet is a very powerful portion of Hiero and Nuke Studio. From here we can be selecting multiple clips, making mass changes, adding effects. If we wanted to go ahead and change properties, we can select a bunch of clips and then make those changes directly from here. It also has a nice linked view, so if we select something in the timeline, it'll select it in the spreadsheet as well. And this is how we're going to import media, match media if you're starting fresh with an EDL, an XML, or an AAF. So this is definitely something you want to spend some time with, as we can also be filtering and flagging shots of particular types, all directly from within the spreadsheet. Now I'm going to jump back over to my finishing layout for a minute, and I just want to show you one other thing we've made. Because we're going to be focusing on review, it's a good idea to build up your own custom layout. For instance, I have one called Review, and you'll see that it lays it out and it's very viewer-centric. So we want to have a big portion of the UI dedicated to the viewer itself. We still have access to our timeline below as we want to be working with that. And you also have access to your project, node graph, curve editor, and dope sheet. So this is something that you can set up and it will travel across all the applications. Now, if we have a look at how the sequence tracks are laid out, I've set this up for different stages of the pipeline. You see we have storyboards, then moving to animatics, lights, mats. We have particle simulation, lighting effects, all the way up to comp. Now, this is a great way to set up your sequences. We have an organized timeline by department. This becomes especially useful for the review session if you want to isolate a stage of the production. Now, one of the most powerful features that all three applications share is the ability to switch through versions very quickly, and this is very important for review. So what this means is that we can select this clip, and then I can hit Alt up or down arrows to toggle through different versions. If I hover over the clip, then we can see all the versions available, and I can just switch to them that way as well. Now we can do this for multiple clips. We can grab a bunch of them, jump to the maximum version, the minimum version, all within a hotkey. We can also be comparing for the review different versions of the shot, and we can do this through the version bin. But not only that, we can also be comparing departments or different tracks to one another. So for example, if I select this lights and then I isolate it into the viewer by hitting the 1 key, I now have it solely inside of here. Now what I can do is select the animatics, hit 2, and now we're doing a direct comparison between the two departments. And this is great because we have different options on how we want to view this. We can be doing a simple wipe, or we can be going in and doing something like difference where we can really get in there and go and do the pixel inspection. So we have different wipes available to us. We can do the under, over, minus, onion skin, invert, add, and the difference that we're looking at. But we can also do things like stack things horizontally. So if I jump over to the horizontal, we can have them stacked side by side. Then we can go in and we can be playing it through this way. We can also be stacking them on a vertical stack. So whatever suits your review session or your inspection of the pixels, we have all the available options for you. Now we can jump back to wipe and we can toggle the wipe on and off by hitting the W key. Now just a couple of other things to note from here. If we wanted to compare different tracks, we can be completely viewer-centric in the sense of we have our viewer in full screen and then we can jump to different tracks from here. So maybe for the lighting department, I want to compare it against the lighting effects that were rendered for this. We can do the same thing as well. So we can be all in the viewer and comparing and jumping through different tracks directly from here. Also note that if you have multi-layered EXR, the viewer is capable of reading all the EXR passes. You can see inside of here that we have a bunch of them. And this is a great way we can be doing AOV inspection or troubleshooting as well for review. So I'm just going to turn off the wipe by hitting W, and I want to view all tracks, make sure that's checked. And I'm going to just jump over to the finishing layout because we're going to be quickly talking about soft effects. Soft effects are effects that are optimized for the timeline to run in real time as we play through the sequence. Now if we take a look at this project, we already have some on some clips, we have some transforms, we have some time warps, and we can be adding additional soft effects by selecting a clip, right-clicking, and then under effects we can go ahead and add one. Now note that Create Comp and Create Comp Special are Nuke Studio exclusive ones. So we have a lot of core soft effects here, especially if you're a VFX editor or a supervisor, that you can be placing into the timeline. So we have things like the transforming, mirroring, time warping it, as well as color soft effects, and even things like burn in and chroma key are inside of here. Now, if we want to, we can be selecting it and adding a soft effect to a clip, but we can also be doing it at a sequence level. If I add a new track, a new video track, select the actual track itself, I can right-click and under effects. I'll do one of the most common ones, especially for review, which is the burn-in. Now from here we have all the properties for this where we can make any visual adjustments that we want to, but we can also be choosing what type of information that we are seeing in different areas of the actual frame itself. Now, a lot of studios like to have their own custom burn-in that they're using for the shots. So what we can do is use and take advantage of adding a blink script soft effect. And what that means is blink scripting is the GPU accelerated language by Foundry, and this is optimized for speed and efficiency and great for the timeline. Now you essentially build this the same way you build a Nuke gizmo in the sense that you have nodes that are blink script enabled, and then you'd be grouping them and then creating a sort of macro out of that or a gizmo out of that, and that is being used inside of the timeline as a soft effect. So I'm just going to delete this blink script one for a second. Now let's look at how we can be doing this on a clip level. So if I select a clip, let's just go in and maybe we'll grab this guy over here, and we're going to be adding a soft effect to it. So if I right click, add an effect, and maybe I'll add a transform to it, we'll see that the soft effect is now tagged alongside right above the clip. Now another nice thing that we can do is we can have a soft effect associated specifically with this version, and this again becomes important for review, and it can become extremely important for color space issues. So if we right click and open this inside of a timeline view, we'll see that we have the clip isolated. So from here we can add a new video track, and then we can go and be adding a effect. So whether it is a grade, a LUT, a CDL, a color space node, or a color correct, well, what we can be doing is adding it, and it's now associated with this version of the clip. So that means if color space profiles or the grading changes on a clip basis as we're going in, we can tag that solely with the clip. Now if I jump back to the sequence, and I'll just erase this transform here, you'll see that there is a purple line above this clip, and that's indicating that there is a soft effect inside of the timeline view that is being tagged along with this version. If I jump to a different version, we'll see that purple line goes away. So this is especially useful if you are changing grading throughout, or you're having a different color profile associated with the clip throughout your project. Now let's get into project organization before our review session, and we can do this via tagging, and this can be done throughout the entire project and can be handy for review. So what I'm going to do is just right click over here and open up our tags window, and from here we'll see out of the box we have quite a few tags that we can be using. So some nice ones like apps, we have markers that are quite useful, and a status. And status is especially useful because what you can do is you can have this attached to your asset manager, so it's in line with it, meaning that we can have our finals linked up with our finals in progress, etc. So some very handy things that you can find with the tags. You can even create your own custom ones. So now how tagging works is we can be applying them by right clicking on the clip, but we can also just be dragging and dropping. Let me turn on my comp layer here for a minute, and I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop directly onto a clip. So when we add it to a clip, we can select the tag itself, and then from here we have some input fields, so we can be adding notes directly onto the tag itself. We can also be injecting custom metadata directly into the clip. Here we have our key and our value. We can be changing the tag types and then switching through multiple tags and adding different notes. Because these clip containers can have multiple tags, I can add another one in here. We can keep on stacking these tags up. So we can be applying them by dragging and dropping, but we can also be going into the viewer. So if we were to go ahead and select the tag, and we can tag the whole sequence, we can tag a particular frame, and then if I just jump over here, I'll tag another frame. And this is also very helpful for review, because what we can do is we can be isolating key frames, and then from there we can go and hit Alt Shift and then the arrow keys left and right, and we can be jumping through these tags directly into our timeline. We can also be tagging by the track item, which is under our playhead, and we can also tag a clip. Now another powerful thing we can do with tags is filter by the tag type, and this is great if we're prepping for the review session and say some shots are blocked because they're awaiting approval. Well, we can filter these shots. So I'm just going to jump over to my review workspace. So from here I'm going to open up the project tab. Now we can see that we have shots that have multiple tags on them. Well, we can just go in and filter by a particular tag type if we want. And if I jump over to my tags, what I'll do is go under the status, and then I only want to isolate the shots that are awaiting approval. So what I can do is grab the awaiting approval tag and then drop it directly into the search bar into our project window, and then just like that we have all the shots isolated. Now from here we could go in and we can double click, and then we can view these shots individually if we want to view them this way. What we could also do is create a new sequence from them, and then we have them isolated onto a sequence. Now this is a nice way to view them because we can be comparing shots for continuity. I can drag and drop one into the buffer, and then let's grab another one over here and then place it into our B buffer. And now I can do a direct comparison for continuity. If there's multiple versions, I can just hit the V key, and then I'll have access to that new other version that's in there as well. So now toggling versions with the V key, I'm looking at what is in the A buffer this way. If I want to toggle the version of what's going on in the B buffer, all I need to do is activate the info bar and then switch to the B, and then when I hit V now, I'm looking for the versions in the B buffer. Now not only can we use tags to search inside of our project window, but we can also use this in our spreadsheet. So let's just jump over to the conform layout for a second. Now from here we have access to our spreadsheet very quickly. I'll pull it out just a little bit, and now I want to just filter some shots, and we have a search bar in here that accepts text, but we can also drag tags in there. So I want to go and grab the awaiting approval tag and place it in, and we can even put multiple tags in here. So I also have some shots that are blocked. I'm going to drag it and drop it in there. We have multiple tags now that we're searching for, and then they all show up. The nice thing about this is that we can quickly get to these shots rather than having to navigate through them in the timeline, because that can be difficult if they're spread out. All I need to do is hold down Alt and then select the shot, and then it'll show up directly inside of our viewer. So really a great way to isolate shots by utilizing this filtering of the tags, making sure we're adding notes in those tags, and then using the spreadsheet to navigate through. So tagging becomes a very important part for project organization, injecting custom metadata, and project progression. So now let's move on to annotations, and these are great when we want to be more visual with the notes that we have. So we can inject notes to tags, but if we want to mark up the actual shots themselves, we want visual communication with other departments, with the artists, whatever the case is, we'll be able to do that using the annotation system. So for this, I'm just going to jump over to my review layout. And this becomes an extremely important part, obviously, that's going to be used a lot during the review session. So let me just turn off our burn-in for a second. Now we can toggle our annotation system by selecting the little paintbrush up here, and then we'll have all the appropriate tools for it. Now we can do a couple of things with this. We can be doing this on a sequence. So if I select the sequence as what we're going to be adding the annotation to, and then I'm going to go ahead and select the current frame, and I'm going and pick a color. Maybe let's just move over to this shot over here. We can adjust the size of this as well. And then we begin to draw out. So say we want to annotate inside of here, maybe something in the background here. There's too much to focus. We can go in and then add some drawing, and then we can add some text. So too much depth of field. And then from here, we can be going and modifying the placement of our annotation and our text. And now let's see what's happened. We added it to a frame. So we'll see down here that we have a new track. It's called annotation, and this is because we added it to a sequence, and it's only affecting that single frame. Now what we can do is we can, it's editable just like it is, because just like anything else, because it's on a track. So we can go in and we can be adjusting the length of it, adjusting whatever we want to directly from the actual timeline. Now we can also stack annotations. If I add another annotation, and let me just move right over here, we'll choose a different color. And then I'm also going to add it to the sequence. So I'll add a new one, and we'll see that second data comes in for the next annotation. And then we draw something over here, and then we can go ahead and add a note for the claw. So now we have a second annotation, and we can see them stacked up, and we can select the different annotations by selecting the little pop-up that we have directly inside of the viewer. So this is how we can be annotating at a sequence level. Now we can also annotate on a clip level. So let's go down to the actual, I'm going to turn off the comp layer actually, and then move down to the lighting for a minute. So if I select this clip, and then instead of doing a sequence, I'm going to be adding it to the clip and not the current frame. I'll do the current item. I'll go ahead and select the brush and then just draw out on here. So we're going to be adding an annotation here. Now the difference is we'll see that we have a blue line above our clip, and that means it's now isolated within our clip. And this is important, especially for review, because then if we're making any notes to a particular version, we can see if this note has been addressed. So what that means is if I was to go in and open this again inside of the timeline view, we'll see that we now have the annotation that is associated with the clip in isolation. That is version 2. That means if we've added an annotation and we have an issue with the actual character itself, this new version has come in, we go ahead and jump to the next version of it, and the annotation is only associated with that previous clip. So we can go in and see if that annotation is addressed, and we can see if our notes have been taken into consideration. So extremely handy, extremely important part of review, as we can be going in, making these visual notes, and then seeing if these things are addressed by toggling back and forth. So whether you want to be doing this at a sequence level is going to be depending on the case, as well as be doing it on a clip level. Now what if we're looking at a couple of shots inside of our viewer, we're comparing them, and we want to add annotations? How can we determine which shot is going to get the annotation? So let's take a look at that. Now I'm just going to move over to this shot over here, and let's turn on our comp track. Okay, so we want to compare our comp, and then we want to compare, let's say, our lighting. And so we have these two shots inside of here. Now let's begin to annotate here. So what I'm going to do is grab the annotation and then add a new one, and let's go ahead and hit new. So as I begin to annotate over here, let's just grab my brush and draw this out, and maybe we're just going to add an arrow. We're making a note here. So we've added an annotation to the initial item that's in the A buffer, but what if I want to also add one to the B buffer? So a good way to handle this is, let's look at it as a vertical stack for the second. Now, again, we're going to use that info bar, so we can toggle it on using the eyedropper. And then when I select it, I can now switch to the second shot that's in the viewer, and then begin to annotate here as well. So let's go in and say we're going to add a note to this, the eye. And then We can even add some text if we want to. But now if we pull back here, we can see that we have an annotation that's been placed into the upper portion here. And if we switch back into our A buffer, we can see that we now have that other annotation. So we've been able to add multiple annotations, notes, whatever the case is, directly inside of the viewer. So again, we can be very viewer-centric and just toggle between it using the info bar by toggling it on with the eyedropper button. Now let's look at what happened in the timeline when we added it. Just as expected, there is the annotation that we've added to the clip. So when we scroll up to the composite one, we see that as well. So really nice way to utilize annotations if you are comparing shots inside of your viewer. So now let's talk about the next tool we can really utilize. So whether it's for our project workflow or for the review sessions, is the timeline disk caching. So let's take a quick second to understand how the caching works. So in our timeline view here, we can see that we have the white bar, and that is the RAM cache. So whatever's being played back currently is being cached to RAM, and this is what we're able to view on screen. You can see we have a nice buffer that's quite ahead of where the actual playhead is. So this is great. Now this is obviously going to be machine dependent, so depending on how much RAM you have on here is how long you're going to be able to go ahead and pre-cache things. Now what happens if that is with one track? If I turn off the one track, and now we have to deal with multiple tracks inside of here, because a project like this, it's a little more complex, right? We have multiple departments in here, we have all the lights, the sims, etc. And we have at some points up to 5 tracks on here playing at once. Not only that, there are blend modes on these tracks, right? So some of them are screened, actually most of them are screened on here. So that means that the program needs to play back all of these at the same time. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are soft effects on here, and this is a 2K project. So in this case, we can see that our RAM buffer is a lot shorter. So if I was to begin to play through here, we're going to catch up pretty quick, and then things are going to begin to slow down. So for these situations, whether we're dealing with this project that has multiple tracks on it, there's blend modes, there's soft effects, it's a 2K project, or moving into a larger range project, maybe it's a 4K or 8K project, we want to be able to prep those sections of the timeline using the timeline disk caching. So it's not something we need to be running all the time on every sequence, but it's something we want to prepare, especially when we have these massive data sets. It's important to understand how the timeline disk cache works, so let's talk about that. The timeline disk cache will take the result of all the tracks that are visible to create an image of what we're seeing in our viewer. And that's the result here. It's going to flatten all the tracks into a single EXR sequence to disk and apply that as a hard disk cache in the timeline. So again, it takes all the accumulation, soft effects, all the blend tracks that we have on here with the screens, and it's going to flatten it into a single EXR sequence and then apply it as a hard disk cache or a timeline disk cache. Okay, so let's see how we can apply something like that. So we do have our cache menu up the top where we can do it. We have a quick icon here where we can jump to cache our sequence range, clear it, and jump to our cache settings where we can set up the EXR compression type, paths, and how much size, as well as some other preferences. But we can also be right-clicking on image on a clip, and then we can jump over to our context for disk cache, and then we can have the cache sequence range. We can cache the selected shot ranges, meaning if I'm grabbing a couple that span across the sequence, or I can also disk cache the in and out points. So I'm going to be doing that for this section right over here that has the most tracks. I'll hit Shift U just to isolate that, and I'm going to just jump to the in and out. So from here I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to disk cache and cache the in and out range. Now once we do that, we can see we have an orange bar that is filling up, and that is our timeline disk cache. So for a section like this that is very heavy, there's a lot of data that's going through here. We have like 5 2K images plus soft effects. This is something that I would definitely want to be doing a timeline disk cache for in this portion of the sequence. So once it fills up, we're now playing back through using our timeline disk cache. We don't have to rely on our RAM for this section of the project. Now what this means is we can disk cache our timelines for different scenarios of our sequence. So for instance, if I go down here to our lights section here, and because our particle simulation, everything is already on a different track, if I just switch this over to version 3, well, what happens is we're going to lose our timeline disk cache for this because we haven't cached for this situation where version 3 was visible in the viewer. So from here I could go in, and then I can go in disk cache and then cache the in and out range again for this. So now I'm caching for version 3 and then version 2. So if during the review session I know we might be jumping back and forth between these, I can go ahead and prep this by timeline disk caching for this very heavy section where we have a ton of tracks in here and soft effects. Then I can be prepping for those two different style of situations. So just understanding also, now that we have it filled up, if I was to change the situation, so let me go and turn this off for a second. Because we don't have a cache for this, we're going to have the orange bar disappears for them. But if I turn it back on, because we do have a cache for this scenario, what will happen is Hiero Nuke Studio will look on disk, it will find that EXR sequence, and then quickly apply that back on using the orange bar here, and we see that it's filled up. So timeline disk caching, again, a very powerful way to speed up your workflow, to help for the review session, and to really deal with these large data sets where we have multiple tracks, the 4K, the 8Ks, the 2K with 5K with 5 different tracks in it, the blend modes, the soft effects. Those really heavy sections of your sequence is where you want to be using that timeline disk caching. So we have a new project here, and there's only a single track, because what we're going to be taking a look at now is dynamic timelines, and we're going to link that into the asset manager section. So one of the most powerful things that Nuke Studio and Hiero can do is export media and distribute it into our pipeline. Now at the same time, it can also be used for importing media and procedurally building out our sequence. So let's take a look at that. If we right click on our sequence and we choose export, this is our export dialog where we normally want to be exporting directly from here. And we have things like basic nuke shot with annotation, multi-view. We can be transcoding shots, sending things out as a sequence for daily, processing bins as clips. Now in this case, what we want to do is be creating a custom preset that's going to be used to ingest media. So I have a bunch of them here, so we're not going to actually run the export dialog. Now what they're doing is it's looking in our project root for a folder structure of our shot name, and then a subfolder called 02 animatics. And then it's looking for files that have the shot name and then a version number after it, and they're going to be coming from an external render. So I'm not going to export, I'm going to close. So what this means is whether the renders are done already, or whether the animatics are done already, or they are currently being worked on, we can still prep the timeline. And this is a huge time saver. Instead of having to find those clips on disk, bring them into our project bin, and then bring them into the timeline and line them up, we can actually prep this with a single click. So let's go ahead and select all of our clips. We're going to right click and we're going to choose build track from export structure. So from here we can build it into a new track, and the track name we're going to call it is animatics. And the preset that we want to use is the animatics preset. So I have a bunch of ones already built up, and I'm going to go ahead and build it. So what it's doing is it's scanning the network, it's looking in those folders, and if it finds a match to all the criteria we've listed, it's going to automatically bring it into the timeline, and that's exactly what's happened here. So just like that, we've built an animatics track. So we can do this again and continue to build up all the different stages of our pipeline and from all the departments. So I'm going to build a track from an export structure. I'm going to go in, and this time I'll choose the lights. It's coming from an external render. And then I'll go ahead and I will build it out. It's going to go and find all the shots from lighting and then bring it directly into the timeline. Now this is extremely powerful. It's a huge speed and boost to the workflow and the process of building up a project. And it's also the basis of things that we can be utilizing with our asset manager. So now let's take a look at that. Let's talk about asset manager integration. Now we're going to look at something from our Python examples that you can download from our Hiero Python dev guide. And this relates back to the tagging that we had a look at, as well as the building tracks from an export structure. Now we have the example, it's called Shot Manager, and as we go through this, I want you to think about this in the context of the asset manager you might be using, something like Shotgun or F-Track. In this case, what we're using is, for example, is a spreadsheet. So we're going to be publishing information to our asset manager and then pulling data back into here. So this way we can find clips and make a new sequence based on footage that's assigned to us. Maybe we're going to be doing a review session of the lighting, and we just want to dynamically build a track out from that. So if I go in Shot Manager and I import from spreadsheet, it's going to go ahead and build out this sequence for us. So we pulled information from our Shot Manager that was tagged. So maybe it was somebody, the project coordinator, maybe it was a supervisor that went into the asset manager. They've tagged these shots that we're going to be using these for the review session. Just like that, with one click, I can build out my timeline dynamically and then have all these shots that are ready for the review session. Now let's take a look through our example of what exactly is being published here. So we're publishing to the spreadsheet. We have our shot name, we have the file name, sequence where it lives. We also have tasks and requirements, as well as timeline in and out, and handles. Now, if you're a VFX or you're the project coordinator, you could be going in and modifying this. If you're the VFX editor, you can be going in and modifying. Maybe you're modifying the time in, time out, the handles, the actual footage. You can completely create an entire sequence just by using your asset manager, and then having that automatically and dynamically be built inside of Hiero, Nuke Studio, and Hiero Player. We can even be entering some tasks. So like, for instance, let's do this, which just add a note, something like re-render, and we're going to leave this for a couple of shots here. And then maybe for the requirements, let's leave one, let's call it render, say the motion blur forgot to be turned on, so we're going to render with the motion blur for some of these shots here. And then in this case, we're in our asset manager, and then we make those changes, and then those changes are published. Now, back inside of our project here, what we can do is we can go ahead and pull that information. So we're pulling that published information again directly from our asset manager. So now let's look. We've added some notes, and we can see that the tagging system comes into play. So if I select the tag, we can see that we need to re-render over here. We can go in and we can see that we have a requirement here, which is to re-render with motion blur. So all that information that we've left inside of our asset manager dynamically comes into our timeline. So with a single click, we're able to build this out. Now let's look at some other things that we can be using as an example. If we select our clips through our asset manager, we have a new contextual menu. And from here, we can write shot data. So now we're publishing data to the asset manager. We can update track items, meaning that we've published and then things have changed in the asset manager side of things, whether it's notes, it's timings, whatever the case is. We can begin to update the track items. And we even have an option here as an example to submit for client review, essentially creating a QuickTime from all these clips that we're going to give over to the client. So these are some examples that we can be using and that we pack in with this shot manager example. Now, the important part of this is if you think about any repetitive tasks or a string of tasks that you might be doing, well, we can build these out through Python and then have it execute with a single click. And this becomes very powerful. So if you have a certain structure that you're working with in your studio, you're doing A, B, and C, we would link these up. We would have it as a part of our menu, and that we can be running every day. So some nice interaction by publishing and by pulling in information directly from here. We have everything nicely named with our dates, and of course we can make modifications to this depending on how we want to have things set up inside of our timeline. Okay, so now we are inside of Hiero Player. So let's talk about this for a second. Now, Hiero Player can open up Hiero projects, Nuke Studio projects, so we can open up the entire edit inside of here. Now, a big difference is when we select the clips, we're going to see that they're blue, and this means that it is read-only as we are selecting them. Now, the idea behind here is we're not looking to do a conform. We're not looking to edit or add soft effects, so those items are locked off. We don't want to mess with the edit at all. We just want to be able to view it and view things in context, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So you can make some slight modifications to the project by adding clips from our project into a new track. And if that's the case, we're not going to be able to overwrite the save files of the actual edit itself for the Nuke Studio or Hiero project. What we can do is save this as a player project, and then from there, it's saved off as a separate project in which we've made any of those modifications. So very handy for an artist that is working with their shots, working with continuity. They want to be able to save what's happening and what they've built up so far. They can go ahead and save it as a player project. Now, another extremely important thing that we've hit on a few times, because I want to make sure that it's an important point, is that the artists can be using this to review their work. So just like we looked with the asset manager example before, artists can be doing the same thing inside of Hiero Player. So from here, they can be going in and pulling the shots that they work on. So let's say that we're a lighting artist here, and we've sent some shots over the farm. It was a Friday. We're back in on Monday, and we want to begin to review those shots. Well, we can pull out that data from the asset manager. And just like that, we have our sequence with the shots that are pulled in dynamically for us. So now we specifically wanted these shots to come in. These are the shots that I've been working on, and I want to go ahead and have a look at them. So I can go in now, see everything play back nicely, and also have context from one shot to the next, to the next, to the next, and also view my progression. In other words, if I have multiple versions for this particular shot, I can go in and I can get those versions in here as well. I can go under my versions and scan for versions and then pull in. There's 3 more versions inside of here. Then now I can Alt up to jump to the next versions or use that V contextual menu to get to them. So now as an artist, to be able to have this alongside of the application that I'm working with, so I can quickly see these image sequences, see all the versions, see that in context to the actual sequence and the edit, this makes a huge difference because before I submit them for the review session, I can go in, play everything back to back, make any additional adjustments to them, or at least be prepared for the review session. So another example of how we can integrate the asset manager inside of the timeline applications and really be pushing data and pulling data back and forth. So that's about all the time that we have for this webinar. We've really hit on those key features that we're going to be using to streamline the review session. You want to utilize all these tools and make sure they're a part of your day-to-day workflow. So thank you for watching.